What is up, YouTube? It's Alter Ego. Before we get started, I just want to say thank you for all the support I got on the last video. It was only my second Lethal Company video, and you guys blew it up to over 20,000 views. The likes were going crazy, and we almost hit 500 subscribers. So thank you, and without further ado, let's get started. If you didn't see the last video, I basically argued that Assurance is the best moon out of all the Tier 1 and Tier 2 moons. I had a lot of people agreeing with what I said, a lot of people disagreeing, and I also got a comment from this guy. Don't worry, I blocked him. After reading pretty much every comment, I realized that about 50% thought Assurance was better and the other 50% thought March was better. So I decided I'd make a video directly comparing the two to figure out which one is actually the better moon. Let's get started. The first thing we're going to be going over are routes. I wanted to know which moon you could get into faster, so I jumped on Assurance and March and I timed how long it took to get into each entrance, of course taking the fastest route. Here's what I found. So for pretty much every entrance, it's going to take you somewhere between 25 and 35 seconds to get in, except the Assurance fire exit. If you use the method where you jump off the ship as it's landing onto the rock over to the pipeline, you can actually be inside the facility in about 13.5 seconds, which is pretty much half the time of March's fastest fire exit. This works really well if you pair it with the loot drop spot. You just jump back onto the pipeline and throw all your items off the railing. This will allow you to bring loot back to the ship really fast. I tested it with a flashlight and got back within like 15 seconds. Of course, it's going to take you a little longer depending on what you're carrying, but regardless, I think Assurance takes the cake as far as being the fastest to get in and fastest to get out. As nice as it is saving 10 or 20 seconds on the outside of the moon, we all know the real magic happens on the inside. Let's take a look. If university taught me anything, it was to cite my sources. I'm going to be pulling up some numbers, charts, and graphs, so if you're wondering where I got this information, it's all from the Lethal Company Wiki. I'll leave links down in the description if you're interested. The first thing we're going to be covering is the minimum and maximum amount of loot that can actually spawn on these moons. You might be surprised to find out that although Assurance is a Tier 1 moon and March is a Tier 2 moon, they actually have the same numbers coming in at a minimum of 13 and maximum of 16. Even though this sounds really good for Assurance, the part that really matters is the type of loot that spawns. Here are some pie charts comparing Assurance and March's loot tables. Cheap items are going to be items that average out between 0 and 34. Average items will be between 35 and 59, and valuable items will be 60 and above. As we can see, both moons have the same chance to spawn cheap small items and valuable heavy items. The real difference is when we take a look at average heavy items, average small, and valuable small items. Assurance has about a 24% chance of spawning an average heavy item, whereas March has a 32% chance, so you will see more two-handed items on March. However, you will also see more valuable small items, which is nice. To keep things simple, on Assurance you're going to find a lot of small items as well as some heavy items, whereas on March you'll find less small items and more heavy items, but the small items you find are more likely to be valuable. One very important factor that makes these moons so different is their map multiplier. Assurance has a map multiplier of 1, making it the smallest moon, and March has a map multiplier of 2, making it the second biggest moon. Also, this only applies inside the facility, it does not apply outside. The reason why this is so important is because since March is so big, collecting every item inside the facility is very difficult unless you have a full squad that's willing to split up, whereas on Assurance, it's literally half the size, and even if you're playing solo, collecting every item is very much possible. It might not be easy, but it's much more reasonable than March. Now that we've covered routes and loot, let's jump into the last category, spawn rates. The first thing we're going to be going over are the indoor spawn rates. I made a bar graph just so it'd be a little easier to compare the two. The red bar is going to be Assurance and the green bar is going to be March. Ghost Girl, Nutcracker, and Jester have such a small chance of spawning. We're pretty much just going to ignore these, as well as the Spore Lizard and the Slime, simply because these are not very dangerous. The biggest difference when it comes to indoor enemies on these moons are definitely going to be the Bracken and the Thumper. On Assurance, you have about a 4.5% chance of seeing a Bracken, whereas on March, you have pretty much 18%. Thumper is going to be 7.5% on Assurance. On March, it's going to be almost 25%. These two are going to be the most dangerous indoor enemies. If you're running Assurance, you probably won't see them very often, but if you're running March, you definitely will run into these guys. You'll see a lot of snare fleas and hoarding bugs on Assurance. Snare fleas can get a little annoying sometimes, but these two really are not that dangerous as long as you're careful. Bunker spiders, you'll see them pretty much the same amount on March and Assurance, coming in around 20%. Also not very dangerous as long as you're careful. The next thing we're going to be going over are outdoor enemies. You'll pretty much never see a giant on Assurance, but if you're running March, you definitely will run into some. They can be a little inconvenient if they're by an exit or if they're by the ship, but as long as you spot them before they spot you, you should be okay. Eyeless dogs and earthworms have a very high chance of spawning on Assurance. Dealing with them by themselves really isn't that bad, but when you're dealing with them both at the same time, things can get ugly pretty quick. And if you're at Assurance late in the day, your chances of seeing them both at the same time is pretty high. You'll sometimes see an eyeless dog on March, very rarely see an earthworm, rarely see a baboon hawk on Assurance, but you will see them on March. These have never been a problem for me. They're only a problem if they outnumber you, so as long as you stay away from them, you should be okay. There is one thing we haven't gone over yet, and it's arguably the biggest difference between Assurance and March, and that is Beehives. Assurance has about a 21% chance of spawning a beehive, whereas March has a 35% chance of spawning a beehive, and although this might not seem like that big of a difference, the real difference is in the daytime spawn deviation. Now, I don't fully understand this mechanic, so if you do, feel free to let me know in the comments, but I do know that the higher the daytime spawn deviation is, the more likely beehives are to spawn, and if you just run these two maps, you'll quickly realize that Assurance rarely has beehives, whereas March will pretty much always have a beehive, usually 2 or 3, sometimes even 4 or 5. Being that beehives can be worth anywhere between 60 and 144, this is a game changer for March, and that combined with the fact that it has 4 different entrances, I do have to be a man, admit that I was wrong, and deem March as the best moon out of all the tier 1 and tier 2 moons. However, I do think it very much depends on how many people you're playing with and your skill sets. If you're with a full squad and you all are willing to separate, go to a different entrance and look for beehives, then March is going to be your best bet. But if you're more of a casual player and you like to explore with your friends, then you're going to want to go to Assurance for the simple fact that it's much smaller and much less dangerous. When it comes to running solo, I want to say Assurance because the map is much smaller, you get less two-handed items, and you can bring loot back to the ship pretty quickly, but I don't know how I feel about that statement, so let me know what you guys think in the comments. Anyways, thanks for watching. If you want to learn more about Lethal Company, stay tuned because I have a banger video coming out soon. See you then.